Columbia Entrepreneurship is an initiative formed about 3 years ago at the direction of President Bollinger and the trustees to create and invigorate entrepreneurship programming and curricular programs across the university. We work with all of the centers of entrepreneurship across the university to form partnerships and create programs that are greater than the sum of their parts. One of our proudest projects that was created through one of these partnerships is the Columbia Startup Lab in Soho. It is home to 71 young alumni working full-time on their ventures. They comprise about 43 different startups. And if you have not been to the lab to feel the palpable energy in that space, I encourage you to do so. Another example of the types of partnerships that we form is tonight. We are very pleased to be working with the Eugene Lang Entrepreneurship Center at Columbia Business School. This is the 4th annual Steve Blank speaking event that we've had. We're finally getting good at it. Steve was recently named the Columbia University Senior Fellow for Entrepreneurship, so we're very pleased to have him as well as have the other speakers on the panel today. Another close partner of our group is Orrin Herskowitz, our moderator this evening. He is also Executive Director of Columbia Technology Ventures. And finally, I'd like to introduce a new partnership, our host tonight, Steve Davis, who is a proud owner of 2 Columbia degrees, one from Columbia College and one from Columbia Law, where he is also a professor of entrepreneurship there. Rolling out the red carpet for our event tonight was above and beyond the call of duty, so thank you very much, Steve. You should also know that he took a red eye here last night from the Bay Area to attend tonight's event, and he's on another flight back to the Bay Area tomorrow. So many, many thanks. Steve is a partner here at Goodwin Procter and a member of the Technology Companies Group, as well as Life Sciences, Capital Markets, and Clean Tech Practices. Come on up, Steve.
Thank you very much, Chris, for those wonderful and warm comments. And I'd like to welcome not only the members of the Columbia community who are here, but the members who are outside the Columbia community as well. Welcome to Goodwin Procter. For those who are not familiar with our firm, we are a full-service 900-lawyer law firm with offices from coast to coast in Europe and in Hong Kong as well. But the crown jewel of our practice is our technology companies practice. We're over 200 lawyers, represent over 1,500 technology companies that cut across all segments of technology and all phases of development, from pre-startup, pre-incorporation to post-public. We're fortunate enough that every year we rank in the top couple of firms in the country in terms of venture financings, and we've ranked #1 in the country in terms of issuer or company-side exits, which are IPOs, and M&A activity. One of our practice goals is to be in intersections, and the intersection that we're most interested in is this one, the intersection of tech in New York City. The last 7 years has just been incredibly exciting to be in the tech space in New York, which has been a driving force across so many industries that are the bedrock of New York's economy, from finance to fashion to media to marketing to advertising to commerce to health tech. It cuts all across. Another major avenue that cuts across this intersection is Columbia University. And I cannot tell you how satisfying it is for me, as Chris mentioned, not only 2 Columbia degrees, but 5 in the family, teaching and being on the faculty at the law school, representing professors and alumni in their startup activities, running and conducting boot camps at the various schools of Columbia, to witness and to be part of the university's entrepreneurial initiatives. King George II may not have included the word entrepreneurship in the royal charter that established Columbia in 1754, But 261 years later, entrepreneurship runs strong and is very much a part of the DNA of the Columbia University ecosystem, combining tech in New York with Columbia's powerhouse of innovation, creativity, and entrepreneurship is a powerful, powerful, powerful triple play. Quote, "No word captures the zeitgeist of today's business environment better than entrepreneurial. The word is everywhere in pop culture, on the news, and most importantly, reverberating through business of every size. So how can you learn to be more entrepreneurial within your organization?" That's a quote and a question from Vince Ponzo, an alumnus of Columbia Business School and the Senior Director of the Eugene Lang Entrepreneurship Center at the Columbia Business School, which is one of the key linchpins of entrepreneurship at Columbia. The Eugene Lang Entrepreneur Center was created to instill entrepreneurial thinking in all of Columbia Business School students and to provide resources, teaching, and funding opportunities to students interested in starting their own business. Vince's professional life has been all about entrepreneurship and teaching. Before joining Columbia Business School, Vince was general manager of General Assembly's offline education business and also managed the curriculum, instruction, student, and outcomes products and teams. Prior to that, he was a senior leader at a successful mobile advertising company and an enterprise SaaS company focusing on alumni networking. Vince's educational activities, though, wouldn't be complete, however, without being on the faculty of the business school, as well as being a prolific writer and speaker on entrepreneurship. There could be no one more suited to running the Lang Center or teaching entrepreneurship at Columbia University than Vince Ponzo. So please join me in welcoming Vince.
Thanks, Steve. If you ever get tired of being a lawyer, you could use a PR person. Thank you. That was way over the top, but much appreciated introduction. Thank you, Steve, for your comments. Thanks again to Goodwin Procter for hosting tonight. I was telling Steve, I've been in this room at least half a dozen times for various entrepreneurship events and activities here in the New York City ecosystem. They're an amazing partner to work with. It's a beautiful space, so thank you very much. And thank you again to the Columbia Entrepreneurship team, to the Columbia Tech Ventures team, and to the team that really does all the hard work at the Lang Center for making tonight happen. As Steve very eloquently mentioned and described, my name is Vince Ponzo. I am a graduate of Columbia Business School. I graduated 2003 and spent most of my post-business school career working at startups here in the New York City ecosystem. So I really was fortunate to have the opportunity to see firsthand the evolution of the New York City ecosystem, which you'll hear about tonight. I now head up the Lang Center for Entrepreneurship at Columbia Business School. And just quick few seconds about the Lang Center. The Lang Center for Entrepreneurship at Columbia Business School is not a knee-jerk reaction to what's been happening around entrepreneurship. The Lang Entrepreneurship Center was actually established in 2000. So it's been around for more than 15 years. And over the course of those 15 years, the Lang Center for Entrepreneurship has been a part of the New York City ecosystem. We have been an important player, and we're continually working hard to make sure that we maintain our role in the ecosystem, that we contribute however we possibly can for the benefit of our students, for our alumni, and most importantly for the city and the economy. As mentioned, we're thrilled to have this amazing panel tonight. This is the unofficial 4th annual Steve Blank speaking event. Steve's been involved with Columbia Business School and Columbia for quite some time. Steve's involvement started with the executive MBA program, the dual program between Columbia Business School and Berkeley. And about 4 years ago, we managed to entice Steve or coax him or blackmail him or something to start coming out to the East Coast and doing his incredible Lean Launchpad course. So once a year, Steve comes out to Columbia and teaches this amazing week-long course that really is meant to show students not only how difficult entrepreneurship is, but more importantly, testing their hypotheses, getting out of the classroom, speaking to people, speaking to customers, finding product market fit. It's an amazing class. We're lucky to have Steve. And again, as Chris mentioned, Steve was also just named as a senior fellow for entrepreneurship at the university. So lots of exciting things happening. So thank you all for being here tonight, for being on the panel. Thank you all for showing up and validating this great event. We're happy to have you. And without any more introductions, I will hand it over to Oren.
Great, thank you. So first, can people hear me okay? Great, okay. So far, so good. So just by way of a brief introduction, more for context than anything else. My name's Oren Herskowitz. I run the tech, I wear a lot of hats at Columbia, but the one that's most relevant probably for today is I run the tech transfer office for the university. For those of you who don't know what tech transfer is, that means when the researchers at Columbia or any other university come up with new inventions, which at Columbia they do around 400 times a year. A little closer? Okay. Which at Columbia they do around 400 times a year. They tell us about them. We then evaluate those for commercial potential. Could they be a startup? Could they be of use to a company? We file patents where relevant. We license those to industry. So last year we had 115 license agreements. And increasingly, we find startups that want to take these technologies to market. So when I joined 10 years ago, there were roughly 5 or so patent-backed startups a year coming out of Columbia. Last year, there were 27. And that's just from our piece. We're privileged to be part of a much broader ecosystem at the university that's trying to get as many startups as possible. I see many of them here today. We have Dre and I from the Coulter program working on medical device startups. We have Justin Hendricks sitting in the back from the New York City Media Lab, who we also partner with. There's PowerBridge New York, which is trying to get clean energy startups going in partnership with NYU and CUNY. It's a great ecosystem for this, and it's a real privilege to be part of it. On to why we're here today. Part of that boom has clearly been a national boom, and possibly an international boom, which we'll talk about in a bit. But New York City has been completely transformed in these last 10 years. I'm a lifelong New Yorker from a family of New Yorkers, married to a New Yorker. It is amazing to see what's happened in New York over the last 10 years. And I mean, just by way of example, so in 2007, just as a starting point, we had the early stage seed funding in New York was 1/3 of what Massachusetts had and 1/13 of what California had. Over that time period, if you look around today, there's thousands of technology startups across the city. There's intense competition for the grad students and the undergrads coming out of the universities. There's 150 incubators, co-working spaces, and accelerators around the city waiting for the startups to come. There's meetups and events. There's big raises and big exits from some of the firms in New York. So just to throw out some, MakerBot, Shutterstock, Tumblr, Etsy, Huffington Post, and others, and big tech companies planting their flags here. So Google, Twitter, and others doing a lot of hiring, taking over whole buildings. So it's a really amazing time in New York. This last year, VC investment in the city matched, we're starting to pretty regularly match or even outpace Massachusetts. We still got a long way to go for California, sadly, but hopefully we'll get there. But we're certainly catching up. The gap is closing. And one thing to note is it's not just tech. Tech's gotten a lot of the press, and is certainly where a lot of the early momentum is. But as the panelists will no doubt talk about, it has been an amazing couple of years for bioscience. Many of those initiatives were from people on the panel or their organizations. We have Harlem Biospace opened up near Columbia, the Early Stage Life Sciences Fund, which was put together by the city and involved Flagship and Arch venture partners. Alexandria, who's here tonight, Alexandria Life Sciences Center is full, which is amazing, and hosting great events all the time. We have the accelerator. There's deals. Actually, just this past year, Columbia did 4 bioscience deals that collectively raised $60 million in Series A funding and are all starting and staying in New York, which gives us so much pleasure to see. So it's really amazing. I think what we want to do today is try and figure out what is the origin story for this? How did we get where we are now? And what do we need to do to make sure that we don't lose that momentum? How do we keep it going in the future? So like what's worked and what might work going forward? And then if time allows, we'd love to get into what can other cities learn from what we've done here? What might work elsewhere? And what's part of sort of the unique DNA in New York? I'm going to ask my panelists to introduce themselves in a second. Before we do, just to get a sense of who's in the room, current or future entrepreneurs, raise your hand.
Excellent.
Wow, that's fantastic. That wouldn't have happened 10 years ago.
No.
Investors in the room. Okay, entrepreneurs, look around. Keep your hands up. Because there's networking afterwards. Okay, that's the folks with money. Good. Okay. Policy government folks. Okay. Academic partners who didn't fall into one of the previous categories. All right, good. I'm sure I left out some categories. I also just wanted to put in a good word for Steve Davis from Goodwin Procter. They're on our list of recommended startup attorneys, and they've done fantastic work for the firms. I'm not getting paid to say that. Great. So I'm going to ask each of my panelists to introduce themselves, to give a little bit of context around their background personally and also the organizations they represent, and to talk a little bit about how, just to give a start for us, a perspective on how they think we got here. Where did this all come from? And where do they see the current state of play? It's meant to be a conversation, not an interrogation. I'm sure I have no illusions that I'm going to be able to control the flow of conversation amongst the group once we get started, and that's perfectly fine. We'll go for about 45 minutes. So why don't we start, Steve, if you don't mind. Most folks here probably know you, but give a little bit of context on who you are.
So the guy who knows the least about New York ecosystem is going to start. That's lots of sense. Okay. No, but I have to tell you, it was the only intro I've ever heard that used the word entrepreneur, George II, and zygoist in the same sentence. It was pretty impressive. I think why I'm here, other than this is the 4th annual Steve Blank something or other, which I didn't even know, besides teaching entrepreneurship at a couple of universities, I have an interest in the history of how entrepreneurial ecosystems started. And I was a serial entrepreneur for 21 years, retired after 8 startups, and started teaching on some schools on the East Coast. Obviously not as good as the schools. There's the schools on the West Coast, not as good as the schools on the East Coast. But I was really interested on how the Silicon Valley ecosystem evolved, and was stunned to, actually shouldn't have been, that there really wasn't a single history of how that happened. I'm going to give you the punchline. In Silicon Valley, it was serendipity and the Cold War. Stanford's entrepreneurship culture started with a single professor named Fred Terman, who happened to run electronic intelligence and electronic warfare in the United States during World War II, came back to Stanford, hired all his World War II engineering managers, and decided to turn Stanford into an engineering powerhouse in microwaves and electronics in the 1950s. And during the Cold War, the US military essentially turned all research universities into Cold War engineering laboratories. Stanford had a secret 400-person weapons lab, as well as Columbia and University of Michigan and MIT, et cetera, during the Cold War that focused on electronic intelligence and electronic warfare. And Terman did something unique that no other university at the time did. He basically, and Oren would have freaked out then, he basically said to any of his grad students or professors, take your technology, help the country, go take it, start a company, and all you needed to do was shake hands with Terman that you would do something good with whatever you invented in the lab. And Stanford and the Silicon Valley ecosystem started with the intersection of a tech university with extreme interest and extreme focus on a single domain, which were microwaves, and maybe another one, electronics, a ecosystem of ready customers, in this case, military weapons system suppliers, and then eventually a risk capital culture that emerged after these first two. And Stanford and Silicon Valley were what I call a serendipitous accident. What's interesting, and I'm interested to hear from the rest of the panels, is that New York is only one of the 3 ecosystems for startups that have been engineered, period, in the entire world, or at least successful ecosystems. I'd say Beijing, I'd say Israel, and I'd say New York have been consciously engineered with investments in finance, investments in technology universities, and reinvention of an entrepreneurial culture that was lacking. And I'm just amazed on how quickly New York has reinvented itself to do that. Just as an aside, for those of you interested in the Silicon Valley story, there's a couple of videos on YouTube called The Secret History of Silicon Valley, and explains how essentially the NSA and CIA funded the Valley in the 50s. But I'm really interested to hear the New York version of the story.
So I'm gonna start with Maria Torres. If you could give us a little bit of your background. I think it's helpful. Not everyone here may know what the EDC actually is and how it fits into the broader New York City, sort of the administration. So perhaps you could give a little bit of context around that. But I'm interested from your perspective of when did this get started? Where within the city government did the energy start coming from? And how did it evolve in those early years?
Terrific. Good evening, everyone. Thanks, Oren. Thanks to Columbia for inviting me here today. It's an opportunity to be reflective, actually, about what has happened here in New York City over the last several years. So looking forward to this discussion. My name is Mayor Torres-Springer. I'm the president of the New York City Economic Development Corporation. For those who aren't too familiar with EDC, we are a quasi-governmental entity. I'm appointed by the mayor. We have our own board of directors. And our mandate is to promote and help shape the growth of New York City's economy. And for most of our history, what that has meant has essentially been real estate development, area-wide planning. We administer a number of incentive programs and the like. Pretty typical, I'd say, for an economic development entity in most cities. So I've been in this role for almost 6 months. I am coming back to EDC. I spent 7 years in the Bloomberg administration, 3 years at City Hall, and 4 years at EDC, starting about 2007 and 2008. And I spent some time literally in the wilderness working as Chief Operating Officer at Friends of the High Line. But for the most part, it's been a pure economic development set of experiences. I mentioned the timeline coming, my first stint at EDC, because it's relevant, I think, to at least my perspective and the organization's contemporary history and involvement in the growth of the tech ecosystem in New York. And so the former administration, and we're certainly continuing a lot of this work, acutely aware that we needed to do everything that we could to diversify the city's economy. As many of you know, we all weathered the storm of the last Great Recession. And a lot of this work really started after the collapse of Lehman Brothers. And there's a gentleman here today whose first day at the job was the day after that collapse. And it was like, whatever it is that we hired you for, actually, your job is different. And it's to help ensure we are diversifying the city's economy and really taking the types of strategic steps to see a quantum leap, a quantum change in order to achieve that. And so we started in what has become about 100 different initiatives in entrepreneurship. They run the gamut from initiatives that dealt with access to capital, to real estate, to training and networking. And really at the time, because this was a new book of business for the organization, it was really an exercise in a few things. One, making sure that we were listening very closely to our partners, the private sector, the academic sector, everyone who is part of the amazing tech ecosystem in New York, and really developing programs, because I'm not surprised to many of you here, government can be pretty slow at doing things and not always responsive. And so we needed to make sure that we were actually addressing contemporary issues and challenges that tech startups or the business community in general was viewing. So that was one general principle. And the second, of course, was to make sure that government was playing the right role. And so we have viewed our role over the course of the last several years as a number of things. Convener, a catalyst for a number of programs that Oren mentioned earlier, cheerleader, but there are, and then roles that we don't play. And so government is pretty bad at picking winners, for instance. So with the funds, whether it was in life sciences or the angel fund for tech startups, we made sure that while we invested, we weren't actually administering that fund. So those were some of the main principles, which really culminated then in addition to running all of those programs, we also, in parallel, launched what eventually became the Applied Sciences Initiative. And I mention that because while each of the programs I mentioned before were tactical, they were addressing very specific needs that the tech ecosystem, tech startups had communicated to us. The Applied Sciences Initiative was launched in order to make sure that in the long term, we were really thinking about what every technology company in New York City was telling us, a real need for engineering talent, not just today, not just tomorrow, but in the years to come. And so that partnership, of course, Columbia is one of the major partners, had the fortune of attending the ribbon cutting for the new Institute for Data Sciences a few weeks ago. But Cornell Technion is also building a campus in Roosevelt Island, NYU, and a number of others. And what we believe, and we're actually outpacing it based on the progress of these partnerships, is that we will at least double the number of engineers in the city through those 5 partnerships in less than a generation. So that tells part of, hopefully, of the story. And I think as we look into the future, the one thing that I'll say is what it really built on is the story of New York City itself, a city that in the last couple of centuries has this ability to reinvent itself. And so it may have meant this for tech in the last several years, but our transition as an economy from a port and trade city to an industrial city to now a thriving knowledge tech city, that is it's the story not just of the ecosystem, but it's the story of New York City itself. And that, to me, is what I think is an opportunity for all of us as we continue to build our companies and work on these issues. We make sure we harness.
Thanks. I'm going to pick up on something you said in what I asked Maria Gotsch to do as part of her intro as well. You mentioned that the part of the drive for this, and we'll come back to the origin story in later questions, but the part of the drive for this was the diversification of the economy. And one thing that I think some folks who observing the startup scene will say is, it's great. Startups are great. They're sexy. They employ these cutting edge people. They develop local skills. They attract venture capital. At least here in the city, many of the startups that have gotten launched, the number of jobs that they end up creating locally compared to the big banks, the big insurance companies, the big media companies, the fashion companies, and some of the consumer product packaged good companies is relatively small. So I guess, Maria, maybe you can touch on this just during your intro. Similarly, it'd be great to explain the partnership for New York City. I'd love to know, and maybe share with the audience, how did the partnership come about? It predates the startup push. And so how did it originally come about and why? And what role has it played in this? How do you work with the city? And maybe you can touch on why startups are something that you care so much about.
Sure. And I'll just click on my background. I'm originally from Chicago, and I went to school in Boston. So New York is kind of the psychological midpoint of those two places, which is why I ended up here. I run the Partnership Fund for New York City, which is the investment arm of the partnership. The partnership, the genesis was Gerald Ford telling New York City, drop dead. And David Rockefeller said, not on my watch. And so he convened the business leaders of New York, which at that time, the business community was not very connected in and engaged in a productive way with the city and state. You had a crisis. And so the partnership became the vehicle to bring the large employers to the table to work in partnership with city and state government. So fast forward to today, the partnership is a membership organization. The members are the top 300, the CEOs of the top 300 large employers. And I guess on that, the good news is as the tech sector has expanded in New York, and as those companies go public, that leadership is now getting to the point where they can go from heads down, maniacally focused on their business to being more civically engaged. So we've actually added a number of CEOs of tech companies post-public. So Kevin Ryan, John Oringer, Tarek Sharif are some of the newest members of the partnership. Partnership does.
That was Gilt Group, Shutterstock, and
Medidata.
Medidata. Thank you.
Our biggest health IT company. You should add that to your talking points.
Rewind. We'll start over again.
Right. So the fund, the genesis of that is the Columbia Mafia. So Henry Kravis in late 90s went around, as he says, with a tin cup, asking for $1 million investments from corporations and individuals. So we have a capital source of about $115 million, but we are mission-driven with the goal to create jobs and help increase economic activity. So our mission with the city is very similar, and we work on a number of projects with them very collaboratively. But we are definitely firmly coming from the private sector capital, private sector expertise at the table in partnership with government, city and state. So just since we started with George II, I would say New York has been entrepreneurial from the beginning, right? It's just a matter of like where it lies. And you can certainly say that the people that worked on Wall Street are some of the most entrepreneurial people in terms of new ideas, competitive, et cetera. But I think the shift that happened in terms of how we define tech entrepreneurship, I would put the roots of that in the late 90s. And there are a number of reasons. Someplace I read that they attribute part of this to Prodigy blowing up. And so you took all those people that knew about the internet in the very early days, and you, like a dandelion, you set them free. The ability to, New York grew up in applied technology. And so you had all these people that knew about applied technology coming free and sort of partnering with people that were coming out of the corporate sector that came together and started these new businesses. And most of the businesses in the first couple of years were very web-based. In the first 10 years of New York's tech ecosystem, 85% of the startups were in one narrow area: ad tech, e-commerce, digital media. And so I don't know that I agree that we're engineered. I would say there was kind of an accidental thing that happened at the beginning that got this going. I think there was some fuel put on the fire, but I think the fire actually started through some kind of accidents and a couple of things that came together.
And you're talking about the Silicon Alley days at this point. So this is like 95 to
Correct.
01.
And what that did was make it okay to be an entrepreneur, right? Because New York had been a big corporate town. Most people worked for big companies. And the thought of going off and starting your own company was it just wasn't done in New York. It was done, on the West Coast. So it's a little bit like when they had the big boom with the railways. I think those first 6-7 years laid the tracks. But it gave people permission, and it created the first generation of 1X entrepreneurs. And so by the end of the dot-com boom, we had a number of people in town who I would say were 1.25X, under their belts. They had one maybe quick success, and they were getting started in the second one, and then everything fell apart. Then I think we started a nice steady build. Starting in 2001, and you go to today, we've had as much venture money in the last year as we did in 2000, but it's been a nice, steady kind of increase. So I think we started with a bubble, and we now have a nice firm base. So now on the corporate side, that was the
Well, no, the question was basically, it's great that we have all these startups. It's great that we're attracting all this venture capital. It's great that we get these big exits. But in many cases, these end up being relatively small companies in the tech sector. And so the question is, maybe Steve, you can also weigh in on this too, from the drive to become the next startup ecosystem, whether it's in New York or around the world, why do we all care so much about startups? Why is this important?
Mm-hmm. Can I add just a couple things to that? Because we as economic developers, we care not just about the number of jobs, but the quality of those jobs. I think there are a couple of reasons why we've invested so much. One is that as that tech ecosystem has grown, and by some counts it's 300,000 jobs, and we could probably spend an entire panel defining what a tech job is in New York City, but we think there is an opportunity there, given the wages in those types of positions, and also the spectrum of occupations, to really provide opportunities for the people of the city to have gainful employment and to advance their careers. But as importantly, while any particular startup might be small, what we've seen, and one of the things we like saying and really thinking about, is that it's not just tech. We've really developed a hyphen tech type of economy, that the disruption disruption that is happening in the more legacy industries, whether it's finance or media or fashion, that the growth of tech and those companies might be small, have a real profound impact in ensuring that the legacy industries are sustainable over time and can evolve.
So, you know, what's really interesting is what I just heard is that New York has been entrepreneurial since George II. It's really interesting to compare and contrast the trajectory of New York with the trajectory of Singapore versus the trajectory of Detroit. You know, and Silicon Valley. Silicon Valley, as I said, started out as Defense Valley, Microwave Valley, Silicon Valley, Web Valley, Web 2.0 Valley, and has had a great culture of reinventing itself. If you look at Singapore, that is the DNA of that nation. If you look at New York over the last 50 or 60 years, it's also had that resiliency, and I think that's the key word. If we look at Detroit, for whatever reason, it was a one-note song, and in fact, when we ran out of that note, we're still looking for the next one. And I find it interesting to want to deconstruct what goes on in New York versus what happened elsewhere. The other observation I'll make is, let me just finish the thought, is your comment about New York 1.0 being in the 90s versus yours, no, it actually started in 2007, is in fact the story of that resilience, is that if New York hadn't been resilient, and my observation as an outsider was that the second wave was actually engineered, that first wave would have been a stillborn wave and not recovered. But in fact, New York figured out how to diversify itself and actually built on top of its strengths in finance, in ad tech, in whatever. The other piece that has been going on is, I'm old enough to remember the cost of starting a software company when I started as an entrepreneur was $4 million. The price of a software startup has dropped by a factor of 1,000 in my lifetime. It used to cost $1 million to buy a computer called a VAX. It used to cost $1 million to buy software for that computer, because you did what was called waterfall engineering. It took you 2 to 3 years to ship software, so that was another $1 million. And because you were always late in your forecast, we'll throw in another $1 million. Today, computing is a utility. If you ever see your young entrepreneurs sitting in coffee shops, they're actually connected to more computing horsepower than existed in the world when I was an entrepreneur, and they're paying pennies per minute to access it. Amazon Web Services have turned computing resources into a utility. We don't see that, and we don't appreciate it, but that is one of the pieces that powered the entrepreneurial revival all over.
And that was very important for New York, because that helped get over some of the traditional barriers of New York, which is high cost, you know, where do you start a company? And the fact that you could start in Starbucks allowed a much greater number of people to do that. But the other thing I would say is, we were at risk of becoming Detroit. I mean, financial services was like 30% of the tax revenues. I mean, so we were kind of we were heading down the path of being a little bit of a one note. And so I think from an economic development perspective, that got people's attention, and that was sort of, I know certainly, you know, from our and EDC's perspective, a big focus which was saying we don't want to be that way. We can't be that dependent, because that is never a good outcome.
And if you had Fred Wilson here from Union Square Ventures, he would tell you the other missing piece from New York was venture capital at scale. That is, almost every city I see has great entrepreneurs, but no one capable of writing checks north of millions of dollars. And having just entrepreneurs without risk capital is like having one hand clapping. It doesn't make much noise. And the irony was, here you were in the financial capital of the world, but it was not the risk capital of the world, at least for early stage ventures. And I think that's radically changed. Again, I'll use Fred, who happens to be on the West Coast this week, but as kind of the proxy for, you know, venture capital kind of raised itself up along with New York and others stepping up to the plate, where you can now actually get large checks, maybe still not on the scale of an Andreas and Horowitz are raising $1 billion, but pretty serious money being raised and staying in New York City, which never existed before.
And he was backed by a large bank.
Right.
That's where his capital came from.
Right.
It feels, even for those of us on the ground, sort of away from the policy centers who are not investors, the last 4 or 5 years feels very different. So we are seeing I mean, we've mentioned the rates going from 5, and then 3 years ago is 12 startups, 2 years ago is 17, last year is 27. So the startups are exploding, but not just in numbers, they're getting funded. And what's extraordinarily gratifying is it's not just the Web 2.0, $10,000 investment from their grandmother in a Starbucks. These are huge investments starting to happen. And what you're starting to see is actually bidding wars erupt amongst the investors for these early stage companies, which in my 10 years here, I've never seen before.
And you're also seeing, and I think we talked about this a little earlier, and you guys could expand on this, is that there's now a transition from just Internet 2.0 investment into life science investment. Yeah. And by the way, that's been, in my opinion, criminally missing in New York City, is you have some of the best medical R&D, whether it's therapeutics or diagnostics or devices or even digital health, and no life science risk capital that matches it on the scale of Boston, San Diego, or South San Francisco. But you guys have been talking about seniors.
We spend a lot of time together in our teams trying to crack this code. And even in life sciences, certainly we have all of the assets. It should be working. But there's still some missing ingredients, and so one big one was access to capital. And what we did in setting up the $150 million early stage life sciences fund was to not just symbolically say we are invested, this is the place to be, but to actually provide the type of funding to jumpstart that. As critical of an issue, not just for life sciences, but frankly tech in general, is still the issue of real estate. And so when we started this work, we funded a number of incubators, for instance, and we developed an incubator network of about 17, not just with tech, but in some other industries. And arguably, that need is being met by the private market. And so we are looking at what does step-out space, what are those needs today for tech firms, and we hear about such needs all the time. And that's the policy objective and policy issue that we're trying to tackle now. For life sciences, it's the same thing, and so the punchline there, which is can sometimes be a challenge for government, but is something that we're focusing on, is to make sure that we are not solving last year's problem or the problem of 2 years ago or the problem in the wake of the Lehman collapse, but the opportunities that exist not just in the next several months, given what firms need, but the next however many years, and building the capacity for that using a whole number of levers.
So I would say the biomedical research at New York City universities is the single most under-leveraged asset for high-growth tech industries in the city. It's not, in the other sciences, it is life sciences. And I'll also say, too, that a difference that kind of the growth of the New York ecosystem for the first 10 years was basically done absent participation from technology from universities. Certainly the students, were part of the companies, but unlike the Boston area, unlike the Bay Area, where Stanford, MIT, Caltech played critical roles, and it was technology from universities going out, being commercialized. That is not how we built things in New York. We built things from technology coming out of corporations or just from individual entrepreneurs using new technologies towards traditional industries. So I think that actually bodes extremely well for New York in terms of our ability to continue to grow and scale our tech sectors, is because we have all of this asset which we have just begun to pay attention to and pay attention to in a way that's about commercializing the technology here. We've done a fabulous job licensing, as Oren said. You had statistics I didn't even know. Those are great. But I think they prove the point that we've not really taken advantage of that. And being a former investment banker, I can make New York one on kind of anything if I need to. But I do a chart where I strip out life sciences. We're still a long way from California, but if you take life science venture money out of the numbers between Boston and New York, we are way ahead of Boston. So if you do apples to apples, we're actually ahead of Boston. So
what's really interesting, what you said, and I don't want to be the guy pointing out the dead moose on the table, but I was
Nobody likes that guy.
I was, yeah, I know, but since I get to go home and don't have to stay, I could say this. I have
You're
to
still
tell you,
if Steve Blaine lecture next year, so we should be okay.
It'll be held in Queens next time. Is that the mayor, Bloomberg, essentially basically said to Columbia and NYU, you guys aren't good enough.
Yes.
And having been involved with both universities since then, I think that was
Nothing like a little competition.
People took it, A, as an insult, and B, as a shock to the system that I think had the absolute desired effect. You know, it raised the game and made people understand that, you know, NYU and Columbia, with all due respect and its long history and whatever, wasn't good enough to compete with Stanford and MIT, and if you guys can't do it, we're going to bring in outsiders to do so. And people don't like to have that conversation, and I have questions about who they picked rather than Stanford, but we could have that conversation. But the fact that someone realized that, gee, we needed to raise the technology game for engineering, and the mayor was going to take not only an active jawboning role, but rustle up a couple of $500 million and a couple of universities to make it happen, was a huge statement of commitment to the university.
And actually,
and it rallied the university.
Yes.
I mean, it's it really, to the credit of all three, right? To the credit of Cornell, Columbia, and NYU. It got their attention, it got the alumni's attention, and it got the competitive juices going.
And so for New York, in long term, this is great for the ecosystem. I have to remind you that innovation happens best in a crisis. Seriously, innovation is driven by crisis. World War II, for those of you who don't know, and it was astonishing to me to find this out, is pre-World War II, universities got, are you ready for this? $0 from the federal government. Zero. It was only during World War II that the government set up the Office of Scientific Research and Development, OSR&D, and we pumped $450 million 1945 into MIT, Columbia, Caltech, you know, et cetera. MIT got 90 million, Harvard got 60, Columbia got 30, Caltech got 30 million, all for weapons systems development. And that started the culture of federally funded science in the United States, which never stopped. By the way, Stanford got $50,000 for teacher training. That's what they thought of Stanford at the time, which is why Terman came back and said, I'm going to fix that. But my point is, in a crisis, we reinvented how government and universities actually had their roles. We changed the nature of government. I'll contend that Cornell and Technion changed the entire university ecosystem, and at least for engineering, had a great, no one was complaining about life sciences. There wasn't a great core engineering culture here. And I think that's changed radically.
Yeah. It's worth noting, I think there's two things that actually both the partnership and the EDC did brilliantly in those years. And it's interesting because they sort of play against each other, you'd think. But on one hand, both organizations had a huge role as a convener of the community. So growing up in New York and having spent my early career here, it felt very fragmented back in the day. Like there wasn't a sense that everybody knew everybody within the community. It was a very big town. People used to talk about the startup scene being drowned out by the banks and the entertainment companies. You just couldn't, it was too big. And so both organizations played a really pivotal role in just convening, in having events where they brought one or two people from each academic institution and a few with the banks and a few with the venture capitalists that were in town, and someone from the mayor's office or someone from the partnership would sort of put their arms around everyone and make introductions, and it really built the community. But at the same time, those were usually very quickly followed by a competition amongst all those people they had just introduced to each other, saying, by the way, we're going to give away one prize. We're putting out an RFP for the New York City Media Lab, or the BioAccelerate Prize, which is something that Maria was running, which gave, and actually with, I think Andreas Hilscher was part of in the room over there, one of our faculty members, but there were a variety of faculty members who all wanted to get these grants, which weren't being offered to everybody. They were competitive. So on one hand, it was introducing everyone to each other. On the other hand, it was getting them to fight a little bit to get the glory and the very small amounts of money that people were offering. But you certainly didn't want your competitor to get it. So it's a very interesting role. I'm just wondering if you think about the lessons, to get back to Steve's point about what the role is for governments or public-private partnerships as opposed to industry or venture capital. Oh, by the way, I think Alessandro Piel's in the room. Is he here? Yeah. So Alessandro wrote a great book.
Awesome book.
Awesome
Yeah.
book. And we're not getting a commission from Amazon.
City?
Tech in the City, which is sort of a flyby, Tech in the City. Available on Amazon. It's a flyby of all of the different pieces that were going on over the last sort of 5 years, with a focus on tech, obviously. But did I get the name right, Allison? Well, your co-author? Okay, fantastic. So you can find him and his co-author afterwards. What is the role that you see that's appropriate for the government and the public-private partnerships? And when you think about, if you could give 4 pieces of advice, 3 or 4 pieces of advice on the most important factors to focus on for other cities trying to do what New York did. First of all, interested in what they are. Secondly, Steve, from your perspective, can this be replicated?
Those are a lot of questions, and I won't appreciate, Steve, your perspective on what happened with the competition, and I won't comment on the specific words or thoughts that went through the prior former mayor's head. But I think what is irrefutable was that the competition itself started what I believe was a pretty amazing discourse in this city about the future of the city. And while different players, academic, private sector, could disagree about the specific thing that we were going to do, I think there was a shared belief, and which is why everyone came to the convenings and tried to find a way to meaningfully get involved, was that the future prosperity of the city really depended on everyone coming together. And that, and even in all of the interviews and conversations that we had with specific universities, they of course thought that they should win, but they also did say privately that regardless of what happens, we actually think this was useful for our university as a way to look inward and think about what our role is in terms of the city, how we are adapting ourselves to changes in the economy. And I think that is something that has endured past this competition and will benefit the city into the future. We have, since then, we get requests all the time from different delegations who sometimes from different parts of the world, and they say, can you please share with us exactly what documents you used for the competition and exactly what did you do? And the best piece of advice, and we do this too when we look at different cities and what they've done, is it cannot be identically replicated, because every city has its unique set of challenges, unique set of assets. And while would an applied sciences competition work for any particular city? Maybe, maybe not. But the idea of convening all of the right types of people to tackle pressing issues that are facing a city, and then government playing the role of making the appropriate investment, marshaling the right type of resources, convening all the right types of people toward that is something that we say can be replicated. And so what that will mean for other cities is something totally different. And so we try to not really share those documents for a whole bunch of reasons, but to make sure that it's really the underlying principles and motivations, that's what we share. As opposed to the specifics of what that competition was or the specifics of any other particular project.
So I would say don't compete with the private sector. Figure out and recognize what they do well and leverage it. And figure out where the gaps are and figure out what needs to be done to get the private capital to show up. So every day there's something like $3 trillion clears through Lower Manhattan every day. So I think the trick was to figure out how do you tap that money and get it to go in one direction. And it may be that you need to make some investments of cash to de-risk things. You may need to do the convening. But I think at the end of the day, we've got this extremely liquid capital market, particularly in America, and figuring out how to tap into that and fill the gaps from an economic development perspective.
So I've spent a bit of time in China looking at what the Chinese government did to engineer, and I mean literally engineer their ecosystem for startups. It's called the Torch program. It's one of those programs. In fact, I wrote something about this. If you want to read it, it's on steveblank.com. There's a category called China. But they engineered an ecosystem that by accident created startups. They were actually trying to execute, re-engineer what Silicon Valley did, was to create a scientific military ecosystem to actually raise the level of their military weapons development. And again, accidental outcome was the startup culture in Northwest Beijing and around the Pearl River Valley for hardware. And they succeeded tremendously in both areas. Their weapon systems scare the shit out of us, and their startups should really scare the shit out of us if spend any time in Beijing. And on the other side of the world, the Israelis, if you want to read the story, it's a book called Startup Nation. You should all read it if you're interested at all on how to engineer an ecosystem. And essentially, the Office of the Chief Scientist in the late 90s decided that they could engineer this by setting up a series of incubators. It was also primarily a jobs program for the Israeli immigrants that were coming over, a good ton of them engineers that were unemployed. And so they spread those incubators across Israel and recruited U.S. capital to help run them, and did a pretty spectacular job. And I just spent some time there helping them think about what Startup Nation 2.0 might be. And then for the U.S. government, basically in the last 5 years, the U.S. government for the last 30 years have been writing checks for a program called the SBIR and STTR program, which essentially funds any scientist who's gotten a government grant can apply for a commercialization grant. And we've given out, basically it takes up 3% of the federal research budget. We've essentially been giving out cars without requiring driver's ed. And the results have been the same. And so about five years ago, the government asked me to build a better process for them. And we built something called the Innovation Corps. And we've now put close to 1,000 teams of principal investigators from the NSF and now the National Institute of Health. And so this can be taught, and the government does have a role in this. The piece that we haven't talked about yet, though, so if I could slightly change the subject. So to answer your question is, yes, the government can help engineer ecosystems. Obviously, you need private capital. You need technology universities. You need a piece that we haven't mentioned, and that's a risk culture among entrepreneurs. And in New York, that was lacking. That is, the preferred job path was, I'm going to work for some Wall Street bank and become an investment banker. Every MBA who graduated from Columbia, or everybody, or every quant wanted to go do that. And by the way, it was safe, it was great, you got huge bonuses, you do it enough, you get a house in the Hamptons, and get really good, you get to move out to California. No. But my point was, there wasn't a culture that says, no, not only is it acceptable to me, the 20-year-old, God, I couldn't even tell my parents I was thinking about doing this. And I would suggest that that's been one of the biggest changes, and you could tell a entrepreneurial cluster that is going to succeed is they have a special word for a failed entrepreneur. Anybody know what that word is? Experienced. Experienced. In New York, you could say you failed as a startup entrepreneur, and no one thinks you have to leave town or you've shamed your family or whatever, because the first time you have coffee with your friends, the first thing they ask you is, so what's your next startup? And when you've gotten to that place, then you've built not only a risk capital culture, but you've built a risk entrepreneurship culture where you now
risk culture,
where you have permission to go do this. And I will suggest you've all probably noticed that change among students and entrepreneurs and even government officials willing to realize that unlike execution in a large company, if you fail as the VP of sales, you have failed. because we knew what that job was. That was a known job with a known job spec. Your predecessor has done well, et cetera. But in a startup, there is no predecessor and there is no spec. And so therefore, failure is an integral part of the job. And unless you embrace that as failure, not that we want it, but it will happen, then you tend to have people run away from it. And I think we've done a very good job in New York and in other entrepreneurial clusters to say, that's just a normal part of this business. We don't want to fail, but most startups actually will fail. And that's okay, because as investors, we'll make a ton of money out of the 1 in 10 that do succeed, right? We want all of them to succeed, but that's why VCs have portfolios of 10 or 15 per fund, not just one. And by the way, that just drives, people in Congress and government crazy, because I just gave you money. What do you mean 9 out of 10 failed? Well, the one that succeeded is called Tesla, and it's worth more than Ford. Oh, no, but the other ones there, that's why government has a hard time picking winners and losers, because we play games of gotchas. And so anyway, so the answer is entrepreneurship culture, I think, has radically changed in New York much for the better.
I remember a moment that really struck me from that in the prior administration. So Mayor Bloomberg had hosted, and I think you were there. There was you might have been there as well. There was an event at Gracie Mansion that Mayor Bloomberg held, even though he didn't live at Gracie Mansion, where
he had a better house.
It was certainly a newer house. Where he invited not just the kingpins of the New York startup scene. It wasn't just the ones that cashed out and had huge exits and were the shining stars. It was a whole bunch of startups in process. And there were photos of Mayor Mike with his arm around all these entrepreneurs who had not yet succeeded. And that felt like there was a blessing being bestowed. It was sort of a recognition that it's not just the winners, it's the people who are trying, which I thought was very it felt like a change. So actually turning towards the future, because I know we only have 2 minutes left. Okay. So looking towards the future quickly, we have a new administration. And therefore likely a new relationship with the partnership. And I'm sure both of you guys are looking at this. It feels very much like the momentum in New York has crossed some sort of a line that hopefully we, at least in the tech sector, maybe we're over the tipping point and this sector has some momentum on its own. In bioscience, it seems like it's just getting started, but maybe is there as well. But I think we would be kidding ourselves if we thought that everyone could just now relax. So looking into the future, for both of you guys, what does the current administration have in the works? What initiatives are you super excited about? And what concerns you that could still put us back to where we were before?
So for us, and I'm glad you mentioned, Steve, kind of the risk culture, because we can see that as both a byproduct of all the amazing progress that's happened, but also a driver for it. So it's mutually reinforcing. And we have a thriving ecosystem today, fastest growing of really any sector. We are trying to do 2 things simultaneously. One is to make sure that we're always thinking about the right role of government, but as you mentioned, Oren, that we are not that we don't rest on our laurels, and so that we don't. In government, I think only in government does the second law of thermodynamics, that every object set in motion stays in motion. It doesn't apply, and so we have to tackle contemporary problems. And so this Mayor de Blasio has been extraordinarily committed to the tech ecosystem. He appointed, which is the first time in New York City, for instance, a chief technology officer in Minerva Tantaco, to make sure that we are, as a city, thinking about these issues holistically and strategically. We launched an online hub for every resource you could possibly need or imagine if you're a tech startup in digital.nyc. He launched an incredibly aggressive computer science initiative for all public school students, and that to ensure that we weren't just thinking about the workforce today, but really, the workforce in the next few generations, and that I think will have a profound impact. And the other big initiative is the Tech Talent Pipeline, which is mostly, it's focused on workforce. To make sure that as this tech ecosystem grows, that those jobs are available to homegrown New Yorkers, and that we have in our tech ecosystem and a workforce that looks like New York. And I think that's an extraordinary opportunity, because in some ways, despite we have different definitions of when this all started, our tech ecosystem is nascent enough that we can make some real, that we can help shape that, and to ensure that it becomes an opportunity for people of the city in different neighborhoods to have those jobs. So those are some of the initiatives that we've already launched, we're continuing to work feverishly on. Into the future, I'd say a couple of things. One is that EDC, as I mentioned earlier, we're really continuing to be focused on the real estate issue, because it is our bread and butter, but because whether it's life sciences or others, a real gap, a real need that firms have communicated to us, and we think we have many things that we can bring to bear to solve that. And then finally, there is what I believe needs to be a perpetual an iterative set of conversations with all of the entrepreneurs in this room and throughout the city, and with the business community and all of the relevant partners, to make sure that we're continuing to understand and always understand what are their challenges, not just today, but into the future, so that we develop the right types of programs. I mentioned we had 100 different initiatives that have been launched. Some of them are no longer relevant. Some of them need to be scaled. There are a bunch of programs, I'm sure, that we need to do that we haven't even come up with yet. And that is the real challenge into the future. And one, so if anyone has a great idea, we are all ears. And we need to continue to be if the story of New York City's tech ecosystem is one that endures.
Great.
So just a comment on the city, I think two things. Also the focus on affordable housing, because that actually is a big problem in New York. So that's a big thing that everybody benefits from. And tech has a problem with lack of diversity. And I think if anybody's going to figure out how to solve it, one of the most diverse cities in the world focused on it, I think New York can play a big role in helping to diversify tech. So what we're kind of, if I put on my crystal ball, so I think New York has, longer term, the potential to be the dominant player in enterprise or B2B tech, because we have the markets here. And that is an area that is pretty nascent in New York, relative certainly to Silicon Valley. But you are starting to see some interesting companies be developed here, getting big funding. One of our portfolio companies, Datadog, just raised $94 million, which is big. That's to be a California kind of raise. The other area that we're focused on, where we think there's an interesting play for New York, is in the digital manufacturing space. That as design, marketing, and production collapse, that there is a piece of that chain that you're going to want to put near the market and the big, dense urban environment with all the customers. And it's probably more the customization piece. But I think that's an interesting area that it builds on a strength of New York in design. And I think it's an area that potentially can create and bring back a kind of production manufacturing job that makes sense for a dense urban environment going forward.
I'm going to give the closing words to the 4th annual Steve Wang lecture. If you could give advice to this administration and to the partnership and to the rest of us in New York on the ways to keep this momentum going into the future, anything come to mind that you think we should be doing?
Don't screw it up. I mean, there are just, and I think it was inferred, but I don't think we spent enough time on it. I mean, what drives this cluster is, like all, is having risk capital at scale. And what we're missing on the panel is the equivalent of, I'd love to hear from the venture capital community, you know, how vibrant or not, and it's fragile. You know, you could kill venture capital in your city, state, or country by just changing tax laws. I mean, venture capital started by accident when in 78 and 89 we changed capital gains from 46 to 25%, and we changed the prudent rule about what could pension funds invest in, and all of a sudden venture capital now had billions at hand versus millions. That was the accident that made venture capital scale. And so we have to be careful about of preserving that private capital. The other one is just a question is, in Silicon Valley, there's a new trend of what we call innovation outposts, large corporations planting outposts to kind of get into the culture. The irony is, I'd say about half of them are headquartered in New York, and they're not posting their outposts in the city. And so I'd be asking the question of what would it take to get people interested, particularly use enterprise software as a proxy. If you want to become the center of enterprise software, how do we get people like setting up innovation outposts, and what do we need to facilitate conversations with large companies' CIOs? Gee, we promise you if you come out to the New York City for the Innovation Outpost for Enterprise Software, you will have instant access every Monday morning with any CIO. Boy, I'd come out for that. Does that make sense? So the answer is
We're doing a version of that.
No, it's one heck of a start. It's exciting to see. You know, I grew up in New York City, and I love coming back, and I'm just impressed as heck about what's been built here. And I see it every year in teaching with my students. It used to be, okay, thanks for taking the entrepreneurship class, and now I'm going to Goldman. What? Well, they pay a lot, and now I got crazy people taking the class, which are my kind of people in a good way. So I want to thank you for the opportunity.
Great.
And, this is great.
Before we close, Maria Gotsch is hiring.
We're always hiring.
Always hiring. Other folks in the room who have job openings that they're looking to fill in their teams, hands up, look around. Okay, good. If you guys could join me in thanking the panel. This was a great discussion. Thank you for joining us today.
Go ahead, Charlie.